Mr. Speaker and members, last month, the House Financial Services Committee Democrats unanimously passed the housing title of the Build Back Better Act to provide $327 billion in critical investments needed to affordably house America and invest in neighborhoods across the country. With the inclusion of my committee's housing title, the Build Back Better Act will create over 3 million affordable and accessible homes. It will fully address the needed repairs in public housing so residents can safely live in their homes with dignity. It will help an estimated 750,000 households afford their rent or exit homelessness through expanded housing choice vouchers. It will address the racial wealth gap by helping first-generation home buyers access home ownership. These investments will help the school teacher experiencing homelessness, the children exposed to lead and other harmful toxins in their homes, the elderly neighbor who can't afford their prescription medications on a fixed income because the rent and mortgage is too high, the millennial who cannot rely on the bank of mom and dad for a down payment to purchase their first home, and the millions of families that hang in the balance of imminent eviction or foreclosure due to the pandemic. Just today, my committee heard from several witnesses on the importance of the Housing Choice Voucher Program and how transformational it can be for a family to receive this assistance. Harvard professor Raj Chetty testified about his research showing that children whose families received a housing choice voucher to move to low-poverty neighborhoods later in life earned 30% more than children who remained in high-poverty neighborhoods. Another witness testified about how the voucher program helps his clients escape homelessness and achieve housing stability. Housing is at the center of every household's economic stability and our nation's prosperity. Without these investments in resilient, healthy, accessible, and fair housing, the Build Back Better Act will not improve the lives of families across the country as we have promised it will. Mr. Speaker and members, I am going to try in the best way that I possibly can to describe what is happening in the Congress of the United States of America. This Build Back mission, this act, is the vision of the President of the United States of America. President Biden has taken the leadership for job creation. He's taken the leadership to deal with some of the equity issues in this country. He's taken the leadership to do everything that can be done to ensure that we invest in the human potential of the citizens of this country. He's doing everything that he can to deal with the pandemic. And he is unearthing and revealing the softness in our economy, in our society prior to that pandemic. And this is difficult work. This is not easy. And of course, eventually, we had to deal with the fact that we have some who are resisting the mission of the president to build back better. At one point in time, I know there was some talk about a $600 trillion bill. And of course, we've heard most about a $327 trillion bill. And so, at this point in time, we don't have the cooperation in order to realize the president's mission and vision about what it takes in order to support the citizens of this country in a way that will help to change their lives. However, this is transformative. This is a kind of legislation that the President of the United States has developed and worked with because he understands what it takes to strengthen the economy, to create jobs, to open up opportunities, to deal with rental assistance and all of these issues. Unfortunately, there are two members of the Democratic Party on the Senate side who does not agree. It's taken us a long time to understand what it is they want, what it is they don't want, but in the final analysis, they do not at this point in time, support the president's vision. However, those of us who chair committees work very hard on our portion of the Build Back Better Act. I, as the chair of the Financial Services Committee, worked very hard with our staff in order to identify what is absolutely needed in order to support housing in a real way in this country. Housing issues that have been disregarded, that have not been paid attention to, housing issues that have gone unattended to for so many years. In that, of course, we dealt with public housing and the fact they were in great disrepair, and they needed the resources necessary to fix those elevators in order to get the lead out of the paint, in order to make sure that the stairways are safe. And I'm reminded of the fact that Ms. Velasquez in New York called me from one of the public housing developments last winter when there was no heat in the entire development. And so this money is desperately needed for the capital investment that we need to do in public housing. But not only do we deal with public housing, we deal with the fact that there are people who work every day but cannot afford the rents. We deal with people who are paying 50% of their income for rent. We deal with people who are on the ground in makeshift tents every day, homeless all over America. And so one of the issues that's become very important to me is the choice voucher issue. And so, in addition to the $80 billion that we advocated for public housing, another $90 billion that we advocated for the vouchers. And this includes not only choice vouchers, it includes project-based vouchers so that we can develop more affordable units. And of course, we recognize what the cities wanted, what they've been dealing with, and what they believe will improve their ability to assist those who are trying to get safely housed, et cetera, et cetera. That's the home program that the cities love. That's the CDBG program, and those programs we funded. And in addition to that, I want you to know Barney Frank and I worked for years in order to come up with the National Housing Trust Fund. And so we had $36 billion that we put into that. Now, given that we don't know what the top line is in the Build Back Better Act, and we don't know exactly whether or not our senators on the opposite side will, on the Democratic side or the opposite side, will honor this vision and this leadership of the president. And so without knowing what the top line is, we know that probably we all are going to have to take cuts in all of the areas that we've worked so hard for. And I am certainly prepared to accept our share of that responsibility. I know that cuts have to be made, but they've got to be made fairly. And so there was a rumor that there was going to be $0 advocated to these choice vouchers and project-based vouchers. And of course, that made me very unhappy. That caused me to have great concern. And I have been working, organizing press conferences, working with the advocates, working with academicians and everybody to help the administration and everybody else understand we cannot do without adequate vouchers for the people who are in such desperate need of rental assistance. Everywhere, all over the United States, particularly in black and brown communities. People have been waiting for years to be able to get these vouchers. And so we have a time now by which we are going to be funding some of what is needed in housing. And at the top of my list are the vouchers. And so I want everybody to know that I've been talking with members of our caucus, and I've been talking with members of the Black Caucus. We're not backing away from getting a substantial number of vouchers funded. I'm not going to back away. I'm not going to be shy about it. As a matter of fact, I will let the world know that I and others that I've organized will not vote for any bill that does not have a substantial number of vouchers in it, so that we can deal with the long-standing issues of a lack of decent and safe and secure housing in our communities. I don't need to say anymore. All I need to let people know is I'm fair. I accept cuts across many of these areas that I've worked so hard for, but I do not want my number one issue in all of this housing to be undermined, neglected, and I do not want the people of our districts who expect their government to come to their aid when they're coming to the aid of others in so many ways. And I respect the fact that in our caucus and in the Progressive Caucus, we have about 5 different kinds of interests that we want to see supported. I tonight am talking about housing, but I respect the agenda of the Progressive Caucus and the 5 areas that they have identified, but for me, housing is number one. With that, I call on those who are participating this evening. I now yield time to my friend, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, who is also the chair of the Financial Services Committee's Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and let me begin my comments by thanking you, as I have done in front of you and away from you, because I think you have placed housing on the front burner in this country right now, and it could not have come sooner. Let me just say, because I was disoriented because of some the earlier speakers and got a really bad headache, but I'm going to still be able to share these comments. I probably did not grow up like many of the people in contemporary United States. I grew up in Texas, just outside of downtown Dallas, and I had no idea that we were poor. Never mind the fact that we had an outhouse about 30 or 40 yards down a hill by a little creek. Never mind the fact that we didn't have windows in our house. Actually, we did have windows, but my father or somebody had put tin over the windows to keep the winter cold out. The good blessing there was in Texas, the weather is quite mild in the winter. But I lived in this shack, and there were 6 people in it. There were 2 rooms. My 3 sisters slept on one side of the room, and I slept on the other side of the room. And the kitchen was not really a kitchen. We had what was called an ice box, and the iceman would bring a big block of ice every 2 or 3 days for 50 cents. So I guess somebody could say, well, you know, his parents weren't working, and you know, that's what happens in this country when people don't work. It may be interesting, at least for some, to know that my father attended Prairie View, came back, and he did not graduate from Prairie View, came back home and started his own business, Cleaver's Cleaners. And in a town where there was rigid segregation, he could only do the people in the neighborhood, and that didn't provide enough income. But he kept us in this house as comfortably as possible. In fact, one night I asked my mother if I could share something that's called hoe cakes, big biscuits, and she would make syrup, and I loved it. It was like heaven. And I asked her if I could share those with the people who lived on the big street. We lived in an alley, and there were big mansions that are still there today. And I wanted to take some over and give it to the rich kids, because my mother said they didn't have any hoe cakes. But we lived in the house, and my father, who turned 100 on the 16th of July, paid $20 a month on a shack. Probably was worth maybe $250. So I grew up in that house. We then moved to public housing, and my father worked, and in fact, I don't know how he made it, and I don't know how he lived to be 100, because my father worked 3 jobs, 3 jobs. He worked at the First Baptist Church, a huge church, still is a huge church that's known all over the country. And then on Saturday mornings, he cleaned up the T.A. Littleton's construction company office building. And then on Saturdays, he would serve parties. And he did that for years and years and years and years. And I hope he's watching this tonight, because I want to say thank you to him, because I don't know how he did all of that. And because my mother did not go to college, he felt like it was his responsibility to send her to college. So we moved to public housing, and as I've said publicly, my father lied to the officials at the public housing, the Rosewood projects. He would not tell them that he had another job, because to do so meant that he'd have to increase his rent. And so he saved every dime he could get, every dime, and bought a house in the white neighborhood and had it moved on a Saturday night to the east side of town where African Americans lived. This was his dream. My father had the house fixed up. We moved into the house. I had my own bedroom. I thought we were rich. I mean, we actually had an indoor bathroom. I remember I spent one night just flushing the toilet, just playing with it. It was like heaven. And then my mother started college when I was in the 7th grade. My father insisted. And so my father was willing to do whatever he had to do to build his family. But the key to all of it was housing. Housing. That separated us from a lot of others. Housing. It is the most significant thing a human being can have. It makes them a part of the American dream. My dad is somebody in this row so high that his lawn was put on display in the local newspapers. The lawn of the summer. That's what he wanted to do. And so, Madam Chair, I appreciate everything you've done and said to bring us to this point. And I want to say to anybody watching, if you live in the United States, the most powerful, the richest nation on this planet, you have no business sleeping outside with 700,000 people who do it every single night in this country. You have no business being unable to afford a house in the United States, because the average price now is almost $400,000. I yield back.
Wow, thank you so very much. I now yield time to my friend, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would not be here today as a United States Congressman were it not for affordable housing and the opportunity it gave me and my family. So the fight is deeply personal, and I'm honored to stand in the trenches with Chair Waters and Chair Cleaver as we fight for affordable housing at a critical moment. We cannot build back better without realizing the vision of housing as a human right and without realizing the vision of housing as infrastructure. We cannot build back better without making America affordable to all Americans. Housing is not an afterthought. Housing is foundational, not only to who we are, but to who we become. We know from the research of Professor Raj Chetty that zip code is often destiny, and that where you live determines your access to opportunity. It often determines the quality of the schools you attend and the services you access. We know that housing is not only foundational, but also intersectional. It intersects with climate. In New York City, we saw not one but 2 record rainfalls. And as our city has become less and less affordable, More and more Americans are living in illegal basement apartments that were heavily flooded by the remnants of Hurricane Ida, and those Americans died at the intersection of the housing crisis and the climate crisis. Housing intersects with public health. As our city has become less and less affordable, more and more New Yorkers and Americans are living in overcrowded apartments, and we saw those overcrowded homes become petri dishes for the spread of COVID-19. Housing is essential. Housing stabilizes the essential workforce that stabilizes the rest of us. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, there is not a single county in America where an essential worker earning minimum wage could afford a two-bedroom apartment. And there are only 7 out of 3,000 counties where an essential worker earning minimum wage could afford a one-bedroom apartment. And if you are an essential worker earning the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, you would have to work 72 hours a week in order to afford a one-bedroom apartment. You know, the central cause of my life has been public housing. My mother taught me that the most important lesson in life is to never forget where you come from. I come from the Bronx, and I come from public housing. And in New York City, we have the New York City Housing Authority, commonly known as NYCHA, which is the largest provider of affordable housing in the continent of North America, housing a population of about 500,000 Americans. 500,000 is larger than most large cities in the United States. If NYCHA were a city unto itself, it would be the largest city of low-income Black and brown Americans in the country. You know, I feel, Mr. Speaker, that we're on the verge of making history. We're on the verge of going from FDR's New Deal to LBJ's Great Society to Joe Biden's Build Back Better. But the fundamental difference between FDR's New Deal and Joe Biden's Build Back Better is racial equity. FDR's New Deal was racially exclusionary, and the Build Back Better Act must be racially equitable. We cannot build back better without advancing the cause of racial equity, but we cannot advance the cause of racial equity without rebuilding NYCHA, without rebuilding America's largest city of low-income Black and brown Americans. We must rebuild affordable housing. Infrastructure is about more than roads and bridges. It's about safe, decent, affordable housing. Safe, decent, affordable housing represents roads and bridges to the American dream, and I stand here as living proof. I yield back to Chair Waters.
Thank you so very much. I now yield time to my friend, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair of the Financial Services Committee's Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. It's always a preeminent privilege to be in your company, especially when you have taken up a cause that is not only worthy but noble. And I greatly appreciate what you're doing tonight. And I would say this: housing is infrastructure, and housing is infrastructure for a multiplicity of reasons. I neglected to say, and still I rise. And still I rise to talk about housing as infrastructure. Housing as infrastructure. If we traverse the highways and byways across our country, in our urban areas, we will find persons who are sleeping under overpasses, sleeping under bridges, sleeping along the roads, the roadways. Overpasses and bridges have become housing. The infrastructure itself now has become housing. It is my belief that if an overpass can become housing, which is infrastructure, then the housing itself can be infrastructure. It's time for us to fully fund these housing programs. And I would mention but one that I think is very important to us, and that is the Housing Choice Voucher Program. This is an important program because I had my staff to compile some statistical information for me, and here's what they have called to my attention. We need to know who actually benefits. Over 40% of these voucher recipients are households with children. 29% are the elderly. 36% are non-elderly people with disabilities. This myth that people are, for some reason, deciding that they'll just make their way through life on the backs of others is something that I call inanity. It is close to insanity to say this when you examine the empirical evidence. We also find that, yes, the wait time is long, averaging 2.5 years nationally. And many of the lines are closed, with the 50 largest housing authorities having wait times of a year or more, and some up to 8 years. Madam Speaker and Madam Chair, there's much more to be said, but the time is limited, and I would simply say this. Vouchers have shown to reduce homelessness, help people pay rent, reduce poverty, help children exit the welfare system, help persons find and keep employment, help children do better in school, help people with disabilities maintain their health, help people achieve greater economic mobility, help people build wealth, help families enter the middle class. It's time to fully fund the voucher system. And I yield now to the chairwoman, and I thank you for the time.
Thank you so very much. I would like to yield time to my friend, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Clark. I don't think we're going to have any closing time. So too.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today on behalf of the American people to express my support for the maintenance of effort of the robust housing provisions of the Build Back Better Act that is before us as a body. I'd like to thank the chairwoman of the Financial Services Committee, a champion for all of us in the United States of America, but particularly for the poor and disenfranchised. I rise on behalf of all of our American families who are directly impacted by our affordable housing crisis. And I rise today, Mr. Speaker, because despite the proposed solutions Democrats fought to secure in the bill to address our housing crisis head on, they are at risk of being eliminated, negotiated away from the revised package. The housing crisis in America is real and growing exponentially each and every month. Housing insecurity is very real in the lives of far too many American families. Mr. Speaker, I rise today on behalf of my constituents in Central and South Brooklyn who continue to struggle due to the lack of affordable housing and for whom overdevelopment of market rate units have created a gentrification juggernaut that has swollen the ranks of the homeless in New York City and across this nation. Working families stuck who can't afford to stay in their apartments but can't afford to leave their towns. The effects of gentrification and COVID-19 have truly compounded this crisis, causing many to be evicted from their homes and experiencing homelessness at a rate we've never seen, all due to the lack of real and unsustained investments in affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, I now yield back to our chair, and I thank the chair for giving me this time. I yield back to Chairwoman Waters.
Thank you. I believe our time has been exhausted, and I thank you, and I yield back.